cold air pressed against the boy's skin as he flattened himself into the dirt, the smell of crushed thyme and damp earth filling his lungs. Ahead, the outline of the Helots' hut broke the low horizon, a darker shape against the dim sky. The older youth's whisper still echoed in his ears, "Strike from behind, leave no cry, leave no sign." He watched the clouds slide over the moon, counted slow breaths, and in that dimmer light advanced, every step measured to avoid the rustle of stones. The Helot farmer slept on a rough pallet, one arm flung over a coarse wool blanket, the calluses on his hands catching faint light through a crack in the wall. The boy eased inside, feeling the grain of the wooden door under his fingers, aware that any creak might end in a struggle. His dagger remained hidden along his forearm as he had been taught, an extension of his hand rather than an object. When he moved, it happened in a single practiced motion, driven more by drilled habit than by sudden anger or fear. Outside, the older youth listened for shouts that never came, scanning the slopes where other shadows hinted at more patrols of the Cryptia. Their task had been framed as service to the polis, part of a long-standing practice that targeted Helots judged dangerous or too numerous. Ancient accounts described these killings as both surveillance and terror, a way to keep a subject population subdued. The boy wiped his blade in the darkness, knowing that success here meant approval from his elders and advancement in a system that demanded lethal secrecy from its adolescents. Across the Eurotas Valley, wealth and fear had been bound together in the same furrows of earth. Helots ploughed and harvested fields they did not own, sending a fixed share of grain and oil to their Spartan masters. Men in scarlet cloaks drilled in the dust while others sweated behind the plough, and everyone knew which group outnumbered the other. Thucydides had remarked on that imbalance, and Spartan officials watched it with constant suspicion. To keep that imbalance from turning into open revolt, humiliation and violence had been shaped into tools of governance. Helots were summoned, forced to drink unmixed wine, and pushed into staggering songs and dances intended to display vice rather than courage. Plutarch later recorded how they were paraded in absurd garments, with dogskin caps and sheepskin cloaks, so that Spartan youths laughed and learned contempt. Behind the mockery, armed overseers stood close, reminding everyone where power rested. Within this landscape of domination, the training of boys blurred into state policy. Youths who slipped through the darkness and cut down isolated Helots had not simply tested their stealth. They had demonstrated that no corner of the countryside lay beyond Spartan reach. Their instructors praised killings that left no witnesses because secrecy magnified fear. Each unpunished murder reinforced the message that the land's true rulers moved unseen, and that even a teenager might be the hand that struck. At night, the barracks lay in near darkness, broken only by coals glowing in a corner hearth. Boys slipped out in small groups, bare feet silent on packed earth, bellies tight with hunger. They moved between storage sheds and farmyards, whispering in clipped phrases, testing doors, weighing risks. Each successful theft meant a fuller stomach and quiet approval from their overseers. Each sound they made carried the threat of discovery and the certainty of blows. When one boy misjudged the creak of a hinge, a hand seized his shoulder and dragged him back into the light. Older youths and an instructor ringed him, faces unreadable, switches already cut from a nearby tree. The punishment came not for taking bread, but for failing to remain unseen. Stripes rose on his back, and the others watched in taut silence, learning that pain followed incompetence, not transgression. The lesson sank deeper than hunger ever had. By repeated trials, a pattern formed. Boys who returned with food and no witnesses earned a curt nod and the right to eat. Those who left traces or stumbled into a watchman's path felt the lash and mockery. Instructors praised those who studied guard routines, shadowed walls, and shared tricks for moving without sound. The community of children sharpened itself around these expectations, treating secrecy, deception, and calculated risk as measures of worth and future usefulness in war. Across the rugged Spartan countryside, the selected youths departed in silence, carrying only small daggers and a few provisions. Their cloaks were thin against the winter wind, and no tents or fires marked their presence. The order had been simple and severe: vanish into the land and survive unseen. They moved along goat tracks and riverbeds, learning every hollow and thicket, reading footprints in the mud, and gauging how sound carried across the frozen ground. By day, they lay concealed in reed beds, ravines, and abandoned field shelters, watching the labour of helot farmers from a distance. Their stomachs tightened with hunger as they rationed stale bread or chewed raw roots. Each movement required calculation: when to cross a path, when to sink back into shadow. The cold stiffened their fingers around the knife hilts, forcing them to practice quiet draws and swift grips until the motions became automatic. Night turned the farmland into a field of targets and hiding places. The youths stepped between low stone walls and olive trunks, choosing isolated figures, listening for voices that might signal danger. Some approached from behind, timing their breaths with the crunch of another's footsteps, striking to leave no cry that could carry to nearby houses. Wind erased tracks, darkness masked faces, and the act of killing merged with the discipline of not being found. As the first frosts settled over the valleys, small figures moved before dawn along the field boundaries, their cloaks dark against the soil. Each youth knew the paths between farmsteads and helot huts, learned earlier on routine patrols, now walked with a different purpose. Smoke from cooking fires marked the presence of scattered settlements. The cryptes lay motionless in drainage ditches and behind terrace walls, counting voices, watching who gave orders and who carried tools, gauging which men seemed strongest, most respected, most defiant. When a target stepped away from others toward an outlying plot, a well or a tool shed, the rehearsed lessons of the agoge guided every movement. Feet tested each patch of ground, seeking silence over speed. A hand checked the knife's position by touch alone. The youth closed distance during a cough, a shouted greeting, the clatter of a yoke. A quick, low strike aimed at throat or back ended the encounter in seconds. The body was dragged into scrub or a dry gully, limbs arranged to delay discovery, footprints brushed out with a branch. The killings blurred into a pattern of calculation and repetition. Daylight meant concealment and stillness, with hunger gnawing while the youths watched families work the land that sustained Sparta. Night offered movement and opportunity, but also the risk of a misstep, a shout, a witness. Each successful return to a hiding place reinforced habits of emotional restraint. No boasting, no hesitation, no visible remorse. Over weeks, practice fights in the training grounds receded into memory, replaced by the quiet certainty that survival and obedience now required deliberate, unacknowledged murder. Each year, the ephors stood before the community and pronounced war on the helots. The words themselves changed the status of killing. A blow that would have counted as homicide in any other Greek city now fell under the license of warfare. Priests did not demand purification, and no family could appeal to a homicide court. The declaration turned the countryside into a battleground in law, even when no open battle took place. This practice rested on deep anxieties about blood guilt. Across Greece, the stain of miasma followed a killer until rites of cleansing had been completed and special courts heard cases even of accidental death. Athenians distinguished carefully between murder, manslaughter, and just killing in battle. In Sparta, the formal war on the Helots folded these boundary lines inward. Nighttime ambushes and silent stabbings shifted from secret crimes into sanctioned acts of state defense. The same logic shaped larger acts of repression. Thucydides described how about 2,000 helots, praised for bravery and promised freedom, had been selected, crowned, and then quietly disappeared, almost certainly murdered by Spartan authorities. The episode revealed a government that treated preemptive killing as prudent security. When adolescents of the agoge hunted helots under cover of this annual war, they stepped into an established machinery that used targeted murder to manage a fearful majority. Night in the countryside lay heavy and silent, broken only by low voices in huts where families whispered around banked embers. Adults listened for footsteps on the paths, sensing danger in every creak of wood and distant rustle of reeds. Children were warned away from doorways, pulled back from faint starlight that outlined the fields. Stories of neighbours who had vanished returned in harsh, hurried murmurs, reminding everyone that darkness brought more than rest. In the shadows beyond those huts, young figures moved slowly along irrigation ditches and stone walls, pausing whenever a dog stirred. They had learned to rest their weight on the outer edges of their feet, to steady their breath, to feel the grain of the earth through thin sandals. Each carried the memory of drills in harsh daylight, where hesitation had earned blows and insults. Here, away from instructors, those lessons hardened into practiced stillness. Some boys tightened their jaws as they watched distant lamplight, repeating orders silently until they sounded like law rather than choice. Others blinked too often, trying to hide the tremor of hands that had already done what they had been told was necessary. They all knew that discovery meant shame or worse, and that mercy, if seen, would be punished. Between the darkened homes and the restless patrols, fear and duty pressed against one another without relief. Around the training grounds and mess halls, the expectation of silent obedience had shaped every movement of the boys. They had eaten sparingly, spoken in brief, sharp phrases, and learned to endure beatings without complaint. Older youths had drilled them in night marches over rough terrain, teaching them to read the ground by touch and sound rather than light. Instructors had praised those who vanished into shadow and reappeared behind an unsuspecting comrade, hand already at his throat, then stopping just short of real harm. These exercises had not been described as preparation for murder, yet the logic of them had drawn the boys closer to that edge. They had cut their sandals to toughen their feet, gone barefoot in winter, and slept without cloaks so that fatigue never dulled their senses. Each boy had been told that discovery during a mission brought harsher punishment than failure, and that returning unseen counted as a victory in itself. Praise had followed those who stole food from guards or farmsteads without being detected, while those caught had been whipped publicly, not for theft, but for clumsiness. Beyond the city, in the countryside where helot villages lay scattered among the fields, this training had taken on a more ominous shape. Patrols of older youths moved along unmarked paths, skirting farmsteads and storage pits, watching the helots work and listened to rumours of unrest. They studied which tracks belonged to which families, who walked armed, who gathered in groups after dark. When orders came from their superiors, the skills of silence, patience, and sudden violence found real targets among those already marked as dangerous. In the generations after Leuctra, elders still recounted how boys once slipped through the night to stalk helots. But those stories increasingly described a vanished world. Patrols through the countryside grew rarer as Messenia stood free and the Helot base shrank. The elaborate tests of stealth and ruthlessness, once tied to guarding vast estates and intimidating thousands of labourers, no longer matched the narrower reality of a weakened city hemmed in by stronger neighbours. In public debates, some citizens now questioned whether the old rites of concealed killing had ever truly protected the state, or merely hardened a shrinking elite against imagined threats. Philosophers from other polis visited and compared Spartan customs to their own, recording customs that already sounded archaic. Young men still endured harsh discipline and communal living, but instructions shifted toward drill, formation fighting, and the preservation of inherited prestige rather than organized terror in the fields. By the Hellenistic period, foreign observers described a Sparta that clung to the symbols of its rigorous upbringing without reproducing its most extreme practices. The Crypteia appeared in their writings as a curious institution of the past, rather than a living mechanism of control. As the Helot system itself loosened and new economic ties spread across the Peloponnese, the old expectation that boys proved themselves through secret bloodshed faded, leaving only reputations and scattered memories of the fear it had once inspired. Across the ancient Mediterranean, the same Spartan practice provoked sharply different judgments. Philosophers and historians pointed to the Crypteia either as proof of unmatched discipline or as a sign of terrifying brutality. Admirers praised youths who endured hunger, cold, and fear in silence, moving through fields like shadows to fulfill their orders. Critics lingered on the bodies left behind in ditches and ravines, seeing in those deaths the naked core of Spartan power. Centuries later, new audiences looked back and reshaped these youths to fit their own ideals. Renaissance writers admired the city's austerity and imagined noble boys preparing for glorious, orderly battle. Modern popular culture framed them as fearless warriors sprinting across sunlit plains, shields raised, enemies clearly armed. The long nights, the hunted helots, and the quiet, practical mechanics of killing often vanished, replaced by stylized courage and simplified heroism. Yet the historical evidence still pointed toward a harsher scene. Military academies, political movements, and self-help manuals invoked Spartan toughness while rarely dwelling on teenage boys tracking unarmed laborers through darkness. In the fields, a youth waited, listening to the wind in the grain, rehearsing the sanctioned act that would bind him tighter to the state. He belonged to a legal, ritualized system that treated killing as training, duty, and shared secret all at once.